HVAC 360, episode number 13, ASHRAE 90.1 with Steve Skalko. Welcome back, everybody, to another edition of HVAC 360. I'm your host, Matt Nelson. This week we're going to be talking with Steve Skalko, who is the chair of ASHRAE's 90.1 committee that covers that energy code. This is a really great episode for somebody not familiar with 90.1. It kind of gives you a broad overview of where it came from, what it consists of, some various things where you can learn a little bit more about it. So it's an excellent episode to not only kind of catch up if you're not familiar with it, but also there's also some things that you can probably pick up if you are familiar with 90.1. It's kind of part of your everyday life. So enough of this. Let's just go to the interview. All right, we're talking with Steve Skalko, who is the chair of the ASHRAE 90.1 committee. Good morning, Steve.
Good morning, Matt. How are you this morning?
I am doing well, and you?
Actually, so far I'm doing real well. We'll see how it goes.
Excellent. So, Steve, can you tell me a little bit about your background?
Yes, I'm a civil engineer by profession. I graduated from Georgia Institute of Technology. And from that, I got involved in building construction and building codes early in my career. Worked for the city of Macon, Bibb County, Georgia, where I lived. I was director of the building inspection department for about 8 years, involved in applying codes to building construction projects. That included energy codes. And from that, I came to work for the Portland Cement Association. It's a trade association representing cement producers, and I work as one of the technical engineers on staff and have been with them for 20-plus years. So I guess, for almost 30 years I've been involved in building codes and standards, and my responsibility with PCA is to, in fact, being actively involved in the development of building codes and building standards on a national basis. And, of course, as part of that, energy standards is one of the areas, and that's one of my responsibilities with PCA is to be involved in and monitor and take an active part in development of energy standards.
So how did you become involved with the ASHRAE 90.1 committee?
Yeah, it's interesting. I sometimes don't realize it, but I've been involved with the ASHRAE standard 90.1 since the mid-1990s when I attended my first ASHRAE meeting. I want to say prior to that, though, I had some involvement in that even as a code official. I served for a time on what used to be called the Model Energy Code Committee on a national basis, and ASHRAE standard 90.1 was a reference document in that, and of course that's the front runner to now the International Energy Conservation Code. But from that, PCA, we decided we need to be involved in ASHRAE standard 90.1, so I started attending the meetings and showing an interest as the standard was going through some of its revisions for the 1999 edition, and taking an active part in those areas, especially the building envelope, because those would have the biggest impact on material interests like the concrete and masonry industry.
Okay. Now, and how did you end up becoming chair? I mean, obviously, participating is one thing, but actually kind of running the show is something completely different. So how did that come about?
Well, and I think somehow it evolved through I'm going to call it a natural process of selection. I guess I've been around long enough that folks finally said, well, maybe he'd be willing to be the one to be the fish in the barrel. I'm not certain that that's how it happened, but I in my terms of my involvement, I think in early stages of the committee, I actually at one time chaired the envelope subcommittee, one of the 5 subcommittees of the full committee. And then, of course, my active participation, I think, over time, as it became each 3 years, roughly every 3 years, 3 to 4 years, there's usually a change in the leadership at the top of the committee, and I think they look for folks who got experience and have had involvement and see if they're interested in moving up to leadership positions. And I will say that prior to my becoming chair in July of last year, I had served for 3 years as vice chair of the committee when we were going through the process for the 2010 edition. And again, it's back to the thing I think folks anticipate when you accept a position of leadership, that eventually you're going to be asked, are you willing to take the top spot? And of course, I entered into that willingly, knowing that I would be asked to be chair. So I got appointed in July of 2010.
So was there anything that you found that you didn't know before going into the position?
I'll say a sort of a yes. First of all, I want to say I thought I had a pretty good feel for everything, and having been involved not only on the committee for so many years, as well as having served as vice chair for 3 years. Our previous chair, Mick Schwedler, I think did a good job of making use of his vice chairs. He had two, I being one of them, and giving us some responsibility, so that I did have that sense. But at the same time, I will admit, now being chair, there occasionally there's a lot more that comes at you, a combination of things between working with the membership that's on the committee, maintaining balance, making sure that the subcommittees, encouraging them to keep moving forward with reviewing things that perhaps would help advance the energy standard in terms of energy conservation, getting calls for interviews, for example, like this interview, which is a part of the responsibilities. But I'm find myself getting asked a number of times to do presentations about ASHRAE standard 90.1, where it is, and of course where it's going. Department of Energy has asked me several times to make presentations. So there's a lot more probably being asked than I might have anticipated, but at the same time I do find it worthwhile and exciting to be involved and help lead the way.
Now, do you have any additional stress, knowing that ASHRAE 90.1 probably is one of or it has at least been up until now, probably one of the biggest standards that you could work on across ASHRAE?
Well, I don't know if I want to call it stress. I will say that there's no doubt in the back of my mind. I realized when we went to finish the 2010 edition and some of the accomplishments we had there, that when we set down our work plan for the 2013 edition, that we set down some goals of what we want to try to accomplish in terms of how we'll measure advancing the standard, and that's always in the back of my mind to want to hope or see that we reach those goals. So I guess that's always kind of in the background, but at the same time, the kind of process that we follow, that a lot of times, which I think is a very good consensus-building process, that you can't necessarily dictate or mandate that certain things happen. You have to let the process work its way out. So I'm not quite as stressed in that regard, where I realize I just have to manage the process, and whatever works out will work out.
Good. Now, kind of giving a little bit of background on what ASHRAE 90.1 is. Can you give a little history behind where it came from and where it how it developed?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I do a lot of times. Just so you'll know, a lot of times in presentations I'll do on ASHRAE Standard 90.1, I use what I call a timeline slide in a PowerPoint I do, because I think it's important for people to realize how long ASHRAE Standard 90.1 has been around. But the first edition of the standard was actually published in 1975. It was brought about mostly because of what those of us been around long enough to realize was the old oil embargo, and when energy conservation started taking a forefront in with regard to building design, and folks approached ASHRAE as an organization, and they brought together one of the first committees and made up of professionals and representatives of equipment manufacturers, et cetera, and put together what they thought were, I think at that time, were really best practices and what could be done to address energy conservation. And of course, once that standard was set in place, over time it's gone through a number of iterations of revisions. The time frame between editions was somewhat lengthy for a while, but it's still, always followed through this process of trying to stay on the cutting edge of what seems to be best and appropriate in terms of energy conservation. I do want to point out that from ASHRAE Standard 90.1 1975 edition really was the front runner to what became the basis for the Model Energy Code that is now what we call the International Energy Conservation Code. And ASHRAE Standard 90.1 is still included in even the most recent documents, the Energy Code, as an alternative path because it represents, from the standpoint of building design, hopefully some of the best and most cost-effective ways to do energy conservation. So it has a very varied history. I will also point out in the most recent time, I say since the 1999 edition and coming forward, the standard through ASHRAE's process, we've refined it enough that we're in a mature period where every 3 years we try to produce a new standard. Sometimes it may have some drastic changes, sometimes not, but it usually is always going through a consensus to reach what seems to be the best and right things to do for energy conservation in buildings. And so I like to think that the standard is, as you mentioned in your question to me, it really is a cutting-edge standard, a leading standard in terms of talking about energy conservation, at least from especially a cost-effective point of view.
Now, when they were developing the standard, you said there was kind of, in the beginning there was kind of a time lag between when versions were issued. Was it? I think was it every 10 years that they were doing at the beginning, or how has that changed across the timeline?
Yeah, and I appreciate you. I appreciate you asking that. I think it's worth emphasizing it. After the 1975 standard, the next real editions came out in 1980. The standard did some revisions, mostly to the commercial building portion, and then the next actual edition of the standard didn't come out again until 1989. So there was almost like a 9-year period, and it just in the consensus making process, it just was taking that long to make major revisions and to determine what changes ought to happen. After the 1989 edition came out, the next edition was the 1999, so now we're seeing, again, almost a 10-year period, again, just simply through what was happening with the consensus process. And I think at that stage it became apparent, though, to really, if you want to stay on the front edge of what's taking place, you've got to act and be able to provide in a shorter time frame. In ASHRAE's leadership, the board took a leadership position and said, let's go ahead and put the standard on what's called continuous maintenance and let us go through instead an update every 3 years, so that every 3 years, every 3-year period, we consider any kind of changes that are appropriate and following our process, and then from that produce a new edition that incorporates simply whatever changes were justified for the last 3 years. And in that way, every 3 years we're producing a newer edition of the standard instead of feeling like we have to do a complete rewrite, because complete rewrites obviously just were taking too long. So that has caused us to get into a pattern that what I think is a healthy pattern of how we do things. We look at things on 3-year cycles. What can we accomplish in that 3 years? What are the bigger items to try to address? See if we can incorporate them, and then, of course, publish a new edition, which the 2010 was the last, and under my tenure, the 2013 edition will be the edition that we're focusing on.
So essentially, you have a new group of leadership, so to speak, for every kind of edition now.
In terms of the top leadership, I'll answer that question with a yes. I think there's an expectation there'll be a change of the chair. May or may not be a change of vice chairs. There was for my tenure. We do have 2 new vice chairs, but it's worth pointing out one of my chairs was previously the chair of our mechanical subcommittee, and of course he's moving up in the leadership just like what occurred with me as a previous committee member. And I think that helps with continuity for the committee as a whole, where you use folks, when you have change of leadership, you generally are using folks who've been on the committee who are familiar with the history to it, because that can also help you. And when you're looking for where you're headed, it pays to kind of know where you've been. I will say, as far as the whole committee is concerned, I think it's worth mentioning here that the whole committee doesn't go through a complete changeover of membership either. We do look at memberships on an annual basis. Sometimes a few folks are feeling like they need to move on to other things, and we look for other talents to bring onto the committee. And at the same time, some folks have been on for a while. That's probably within ASHRAE's procedures. They expect that some folks will roll off so we can bring new people on. But we're always trying to maintain some group of folks on the committee that have been around for a while, because I think that you don't want to have a brain drain all at once. And so in that regard, I think it helps with the how the committee structure works.
So what would now? It's not just ASHRAE, this energy standard. It's not just ASHRAE as far as groups go. Who all is involved in developing and participating in the committee?
Yeah. Let me answer that question. Let me first of all mention that one thing that's real important is that the ASHRAE standard 90.1 is a cooperative effort not only between ASHRAE but also between the International Engineering, the Illuminating Engineering Society also serves as a co-sponsor of the standard, so that the input is not just within ASHRAE. It is a jointly sponsored and developed standard. ASHRAE, though, in their memorandum of understanding, takes the lead on managing the process. And then, of course, that comes to the next part to help answer the question you've asked. In that process, we follow the ANSI, American National Standards Institute procedures, which is to do a consensus-developed standard. And by consensus, we try to have a fair balance of interested parties and stakeholders on the committee, representing a fairly broad and diverse group of people. So that, for example, we have individuals that would represent HVAC equipment manufacturers. We have folks representing utility industry. We have people from the design profession, design community. It could be architects. We do have some architects. We have mechanical engineers. We have electrical engineers. We have folks who are actively involved in energy modeling. We have members on the committee who represent, I'll call it consumer or user interest. We have folks who represent the home building industry. We have individuals who represent building owners. And then we even get into some of the material interests. We have folks representing the insulation industry, or I've already mentioned equipment manufacturers, representatives from the steel industry, the concrete and masonry industry, even the wood industry participates. So we have a fairly broad group, and from that standpoint, it's not just ASHRAE and IES developing the standard, though they have the responsibility for it. The committee itself represents a lot of broad-based interest, also, again, by interested parties, and also what we call materially affected parties who have an interest in what the standard does.
So, from version to version of the standard, what typically is what are the most significant changes that you would see?
Let me put that into a two-part way to answer the question. Let's just talk for a second. Let me mention just briefly some quick examples of where when we were doing the 2010 edition of the standard, when we were looking at things. I want to start by making the comment that a lot of times when the committee looks at proposed changes, in what we have a work plan on what we try to help guide our committee. And in our work plan, we try to consider things that we feel like are technically justified. That's one important thing. Two, that we try to have the provisions in as simple a manner as possible, so that they're used by the user as well as by the enforcing agencies are enhanced. And then we try to have it with some flexibility, so that in fact, it's not like it's only this way to do things. That it has some options. Once we do that, then the next thing, going through that process, some of the changes for the 2010 edition included in each of our, I call our basic committee categories, the envelope of the building. We made modifications to the metal buildings provisions for metal building envelope. We made requirements for continuous air barriers. We enhanced things for the use of cool roofs and vegetative roofs. We made modifications to fenestration orientation of the building. In lighting, we started to enhance the use of bay lighting as an option to regular physical lighting in the building, making use of skylights. We included more revisions for lighting controls, lighting power density requirements. We started to look at how we can make requirements that help use receptacle controls to try to minimize energy use. We are looking at dynamic glazing, which you might think is a building envelope requirement, which it partly is, but also looking at dynamic glazing as a way to use incorporate into lighting controls. We did a lot of changes in the 2010 edition, some revisions to equipment efficiencies for chillers and water-to-water heat pumps. So there's those kind of things that got processed. The mechanical subcommittee started looking at ways to try to further address laboratory exhaust systems and revisions to air-to-air energy recovery. And one of the big changes for the 2010, and I'm mentioning it because this will relate to where we're headed with the 2013, we had a major change to our title, purpose, and scope, where until the 2010 edition, title, purpose, and scope sometimes limited us, where it didn't allow us to go try to address some processes and things that might be viewed as a commercial process or an industrial process that use energy and that maybe could be made to improve energy use in the building, but the standard basically said, well, that's exempt. And so the title, purpose, and scope has been broadened to allow us to perhaps try to address some commercial and industrial processes. Now, having said that, let me comment right off the bat that we're not about to go and start addressing all the commercial and industrial processes that are out there, but it does open the door for us to start addressing some things, and one of the most recent that we did with the 2010 was to try to address data centers, which are high energy use facilities, and allow us to address heating and cooling requirements and economizers for data centers as a means to reduce energy consumption. For the 2013 edition, we're already starting to look at things like commercial refrigeration equipment, like you would see in retail stores, where in the past that commercial refrigeration equipment might have been viewed as a commercial process, and because it was exempt from the standard. So those are the kinds of things that we see ourselves addressing down the road. In the 2013 edition, we're going to have further improvements to the building envelope provisions. We're taking that step of, since we're using dynamic glazing in the buildings, is to start requiring labeling requirements for dynamic glazing that gets placed on the building, which hopefully will help the code enforcement community see what's being put in. We're starting to look at, I've already mentioned commercial refrigeration equipment. We're going to start looking at damper leakages and whether or not there's ways to try to reduce damper leakage or specify minimum requirements for dampers from a leakage point of view. We're starting to look at fan efficiencies and motors running fans as a part of what the standard may try to address, where in the past we have not looked at those areas. And so it's a combination of things that we've done and things where we're headed that I think the standard continues to try to stay in the forefront of specifying minimum requirements for building energy design.
Now, is a certain percentage for every version that you're looking to eke out with these measures?
Let me answer the question that in many previous editions that answer would have been no. However, for the 2010 edition, there was sort of a challenge put forth to try to use as a guide for us to have some percentage of improvement. What's always been the debatable thing is, well, percentage of what? How do you measure it? We chose as the committee to use energy cost savings as our measure, and we did accept the challenge to try to have our standard show a percentage energy cost savings of 30% over the 2004 edition of the standard. Now, I want to mention there is a 2007 edition of the standard, but we chose 2004 as a baseline to give us something to work from, because that way we have a sense of more buildings had been built under that standard edition than the 2007, and it gave us some baseline to measure from. And we were fortunate through many of the improvements we made. We utilized the Pacific Northwest Labs, did a lot of analysis, whole building analysis, in looking at a combination of 17 prototype buildings to help us measure what kind of savings we got with changes we made in the 2010 versus the 2004 edition. And of course, through that, we did see where if we ignored unregulated loads, which are things we can't have any control over, where we're just addressing the things we do control in the standard, we did get pretty much a 30% energy savings over the 2004 edition.
Okay, but that's
now having
right. But that's
having
not
done
always
that.
the case.
I'm sorry, what?
But that's not going to always be the case. That's
Well, it's not, and it's like anything. Sometimes there's going to be some law of diminishing return. But so let me just use for the 2013 edition. We didn't sit there and say to ourselves, okay, well, we think we ought to go 30% above the 2010 edition. I think that might have been unrealistic. But what we are doing is we've set as a general goal in our work plan that we want to try to shoot for, we'll call it a reach goal of about a 50% improvement from the 2004 edition. Now, let me mention to you that we got to 30% from 2004 to 2010, so we're just saying, well, by the 2013, can we reach now up to maybe a 50% improvement? And whether we get there or not, we don't know. We're still in the midst of that. We're presently processing addenda and still having to make some measurement through the project progress indicators process of whole building analysis I mentioned. But at least it gives us something to shoot for, and so we did set that at least as our work plan goal of trying to say 50%. I think what we found when we were doing the 2010, and I think it's worth mentioning in relation to what we're doing for the 2013, is the fact that by at least setting a goal, it gives us a target to shoot for, and so at least it gives us something to guide us. One of the things that's important in this is to realize that we can set those goals all we want, but when it comes to achieving them, part of it is also dependent on what changes we can actually process through the consensus standards making process we follow, because some things may all of a sudden somebody propose something that has a significant energy savings, but when you start processing it and receiving input from the outside community and also keeping in mind the cost effectiveness that we use as part of our evaluation, some things may not be cost effective and or are not practical, or for some reasons are not can't reach consensus, then we don't incorporate it when we can't incorporate them in the standard. So we sometimes, in reaching that goal, there are some outside factors that are beyond our control, and that's not a bad thing. It's a good thing as part of our process that may keep us from reaching the 50%, but at least we're trying to shoot for it.
So now you've mentioned this work plan, you mentioned addendas. Can you kind of give me a general outline of what is the process of updating 90.1?
Yeah, so what usually happens, it can happen from a number of ways. Let me start by mentioning, and I said it in the early part of this interview, we're under what we call a continuous maintenance process, and what that means is every year anybody who wants to propose some type of revision or some type of suggestion for how the standard ought to be modified can submit it formally through ASHRAE's through ASHRAE headquarters as a form to fill out. And when they propose that proposal gets sent to our committee. And when it's given to us, then it is assigned, depending on the technical nature of the proposal, it's assigned to one of our subcommittees. We have a subcommittee for building envelope, one for mechanical systems, we have one for electrical, and then we have one for what we call energy cost budget, which is basically dealing with issues of primarily energy modeling. Once that continuous maintenance proposal comes in, it's gone through an evaluation process. We invite the person who submitted it, as well as any other interested parties, to come to meetings to discuss it. And of course, through that, it'll in its own right, through the discussion. These are open meetings. Through the discussion, if it has merit to it, then the committee will package it in such a way, and if the committee as a whole approves it, we send it out for a public review. When that proposal goes out for public review, it obviously opens it up to more individuals to offer comments. Some are pro comments, some are comments perhaps suggesting changes, some comments are actually against it. And through that process, we have those commenters either by telephone calls, or if they can come to the meetings, we come and have them discuss in the meetings and subcommittee meetings the merits of their comments, so that we can try to sort out what seems to be the best and right thing to do and whether we can reach consensus. Once we've completed that process, if the committee feels like it has reached its consensus, it will then send whatever the final package is, send it up through the ASHRAE process for publication. Now, let me back up and comment that if a proposal doesn't really seem to have merit or we can't reach consensus, then it never goes any farther. It just stays where it is, or we actually will say we recommend that this item not be pursued any further. So it just depends on what happens while it's being debated in those open public meetings. I also want to comment that it's not just continuous maintenance proposals, but if the committee in its process decides there's areas it thinks it can make improvements, it can generate its own what you could call an internal continuous maintenance proposal. But either way, it still has to go through this public review, public comments, address the public comments, engage stakeholders before any final decisions made by the committee. My last comment in relation to that is, once we send it up to the ASHRAE leadership, and if it goes through the ASHRAE board, when the board recommends publication, there is still one more step, and that is if anybody along that way feels like we've not properly followed the procedures or something about it is flawed, they have the right to appeal, and the ASHRAE Board of Directors will appoint a special appeals panel who will then listen to the appellant that's concerned about the process we followed or what we use as our basis for our decisions. And, of course, we respond on behalf of the project committee what our actions were, and then that appeals panel will either decide, well, we think the project committee did just what it was supposed to and recommends it move forward, or if they don't agree, they think, no, you need to kick this around a little bit more, they'll send it back to us for us to re-review. In that process, then, every 3 years, we will process a number of the continuous maintenance proposals or internally developed proposals, and each time when we do, if they complete that process, they get published as what they call addenda, which is a change to the previous full published edition. And, of course, when we complete a 3-year period, 2013, all of the addenda get incorporated into the next edition of the standard.
Excellent. So it seems to me that there's a pretty robust system in place to make sure that, off the wall comments are not necessarily given too much validity, and also if there's some sort of like equipment manufacturer that's trying to get in there, that there's an avenue to make sure that that doesn't happen. So
yeah. I think that's a fair statement and very important one, Matt, that you've made there. Is that off the wall things can that nothing says somebody can't propose something. It's not ours to decide they can't. Think that doesn't have any chance. We'll consider, but clearly if it's off the wall, real quickly it'll find itself real. Right at the beginning, it doesn't have much support. Same is true if there's some entity that has an interest. Could be an equipment manufacturer, somebody trying to promote just their item. Real quickly, because of the way the consensus process works, we're not in the business as far as the project committee of promoting any one product or any one individual. We instead look at things as the whole as an industry, and clearly, if somebody's looking at a self-serving single interest, it doesn't get any traction.
Excellent. So now, what I guess for some of the U.S. listeners, when we talk about every state has a version of an energy code or an energy requirement that they have out there. Is it consistent across the states, or is it varied? Or can you talk to that a little bit?
Well, I think it actually varies, and part of that is we are, for the most part in this country, we are big believers in state rights, which makes sense, and that has always made sense to me. So you have states, various states doing what they do from an energy conservation standpoint varies from state to state. Now, generally speaking, from the Energy Policy Act back in the early 1990s, I think it was 1992. It was always established that for commercial buildings that ASHRAE Standard 90.1 becomes the base document, and I think the most recent. Up until real recently, the 2004 edition was the standard that the Energy Policy Act said that states should use to gauge what they use in their states. And, of course, in their states, we hopefully that they would use the ASHRAE standard, but if they want to use some other form, they can as long as it's comparable to the ASHRAE standard. Recently, now, because of that, then some states might be using the 2004. Some states may choose to go to a later edition of the ASHRAE standard, which is within their prerogative, and of course I know some states. I'll use Georgia for example, where we actually use the 2007 edition. And in fact, I know other states, and Georgia included, are looking to move down the road to using the 2010. I think also what plays a part in is the U.S. Department of Energy is supposed to make their determinations periodically on where each of the standards sits in regard to the Energy Policy Act. And in recent times, I think DOE has at least started issuing their preliminary determination for ASHRAE Standard 2007, and we hope they'll do 2010 in the not too distant future, and people will start using it. But it does vary from state to state, simply because of the ability of the states to do what they feel like is best for their jurisdictions. Many states I know though generally try to stay up with some of the more current additions.
Now, how is the 90.1 used internationally? I mean, is it being adopted? Is it being looked at? How do you have any idea, any feeling for that?
I have a little bit of a sense. I don't travel internationally per se and don't track things, but I know that ASHRAE Standard 90.1 has been adopted at least by some individual jurisdictions. For example, in Canada, I think I understand Vancouver, City of Vancouver has adopted it. And there's several others, so that they in fact have adopted the standard specifically for that jurisdiction. I'm not familiar with any specific country internationally that has adopted the standard on a national basis like we generally have not directed, but try to encourage to happen in the United States, where Standard 90.1 is pretty well used as the base document based on the Energy Policy Act. But I think in other areas, I know in the Middle East, I know some designers that come to the ASHRAE meetings will use ASHRAE Standard 90.1 when they're doing building designs in other countries, and the Middle East is one that comes to my mind, that they will use that standard, and that perhaps some of the Middle East countries encourage it to be used as a basis, even though it's not necessarily legally adopted. It's not like it says you must follow that, but it is encouraged to be used. So I think 90.1 does have in my opinion, has international standing, that it does serve as a base document that many places can use or would use, but has not necessarily been adopted formally as far as any other countries are concerned.
Yeah. Now, from a code official, obviously, you have, when your standard is enforced, you have code officials that are going to be responsible in some part to kind of, check. You have your engineers that are going to lay it out, but to really make sure that it's happening, that rests on the building department, the code officials. How do you think that is going with the code officials?
Well, let me just offer this is strictly my opinion.
Absolutely.
As a former code official, too, for that matter, most code departments I know they have the energy in those locations where they do active code enforcement. They have the energy standard as a part of what's expected to be followed. Some jurisdictions, because of limited resources and manpower, a lot of times will perhaps depend on third-party inspection and third-party certifications for compliance, simply because they don't have the manpower or the resources. A few jurisdictions, though, are pretty active, and I think in those jurisdictions, in terms of having personnel on board, in those that are pretty active, they generally, try to stay current with whatever energy standard they've got, but through training and taking advantage of courses, and therefore, try to stay current with what the standard requires. We have, as I mentioned in the early part of this interview, we do try to make the standard be such that it's readily usable and available and enforceable by the code officials, keep it in terms that can be easily applied. So we try to have that at the forefront. But even then, sometimes for some really large commercial projects, they get so complex that probably many departments usually will go that third-party route simply for purposes of not being able to afford to have highly technical staff on their payroll. That'll depend on the third parties for that determination.
Is there anything special that the engineering community could do to help this out, or?
Well, I think the answer to that's yes. I think especially for the engineering community that maybe if they're hopefully active in ASHRAE and maybe even chapter activities might be the fact that occasionally they may want to, either on a local chapter or even on a statewide basis, maybe try to encourage and hold some training classes or training sessions, sponsor some that not only the engineering profession can attend, but also invite their local code officials, maybe make some arrangements for them to be able to come to some of the sessions, and if nothing else, a lot of code officials, not unlike the engineering profession, want to look for having professional development hours as part of their continuing education, have them come to these sessions that, at least nothing else, at least get them exposed to some of what the standard requires. And I think, at least through a combined effort, you'll see more enforcement take place, or at least more compliance take place than you would if you just totally leave them out of the loop.
So now, talking about 90.1 just kind of as a whole, can you kind of describe what really is in the standard? I mean, how is it broken up, just kind of in a broad brush kind of way?
Well, the way the standard's structured, of course, it has a variety of chapters. I think it's about 12 chapters. Several of the chapters are really devoted strictly to, I'm going to call it the component part of the building. For example, Chapter 5 is strictly building envelope requirements, whether it be the thermal envelope for the opaque wall or the fenestration requirements. When you go to Chapter 6, you get into the mechanical portion of the standard and things that relate specifically to HVAC equipment, and the various things that come into play. Chapter 7 is service water heating. Chapter 8 is our power chapter, and 9 is lighting. Chapter 10 is electric motors. Chapter 11 is ECB, which is energy cost budget, which is like where you get into modeling. So when you look at the standard, as I go back to when I mentioned, like Chapter 5, if you're just interested in building envelope requirements, that's where you would go find the provisions. If you're looking at strictly things involving HVAC, you go to Chapter 6. If you're looking at lighting, you would go to Chapter 9. And we have subcommittees that handle each of those chapters, and they're responsible for the parts and portions that just deal with that. I will say that down the road, I think one of the other things about the way where we're headed is we're finding more and more that we can no longer think in just component basis. If you want to make improvements in the energy standard and energy conservation of the building, let's just tighten down this one part. I think we're finding that more and more is more that we need to look at the building as a whole, and I think not only right now, but in the future especially, I think we're going to be looking at more emphasis on whole building design, especially for your larger commercial buildings, because I think that approach is where folks looking at all the parts put together can really see where their energy efficiency can be gained instead of just looking at the parts and portions.
Now, when you take a look at the 2007 version versus the 2010, I know you kind of alluded to a little bit, but where are the significant changes between those two versions that people would recognize? Well,
I think let me mention. Let me just go back over. First of all, let me mention this so you'll know. From the 2007 to the 2010 edition, the ASHRAE Standard Committee processed approximately 109 addenda, which are 109 individual changes. Now, I want to say of those 109, not all of them resulted in significant changes or even necessarily significant energy cost savings. Some of them were simply trying to clarify. Somebody maybe was having difficulties in what and how something applied. But when it comes to the bigger items, some of the areas that were the biggest changes were definitely changes to the building envelope with regard to metal buildings, where the previous 2007 edition, the stringency probably was not quite where it needed to be, so that has been increased. We didn't have requirements for continuous air barriers in the 2007 edition, but we now do have requirements that the building envelope, the designer look at it with the standpoint of trying to minimize air infiltration, so there's provisions for continuous air barriers. The 2007 edition didn't give a lot of guidance on orientation of the building as far as fenestration, so you reduce heat gain from the sun, where now the 2010 edition does. There's a lot more requirements in there for use of daylighting and use of lighting controls in the 2010 edition that were not in the 2007 edition. There's requirements for a portion of the receptacle loads to have controls on the receptacle loads that would, in fact, turn the receptacles off during non-operating hours, so as to make sure that folks aren't just unnecessarily leaving equipment plugged in that's using energy but not being used during off hours. There's going to be some changes with regard to mechanical equipment efficiencies, chiller efficiencies that are revised from what the 2007 edition of the standard had. The mechanical subcommittee tried to look more at the laboratory exhaust and exhaust systems and see if there wasn't, and not see if there was, did in fact make some revisions to how those things are handled. And of course, the thing I mentioned, for at least in a broad sense, is the title, purpose, and scope change was a big change because the 2007 had exceptions for commercial industrial processes, where the 2010 edition doesn't totally eliminate them, but it definitely allows for a little bit broader use of the standard if there are provisions in there. And, of course, I mentioned earlier about economizers and data centers was one of the first things that we did undertake as a part of our expanded title, purpose, and scope.
So now, if somebody wanted to learn more about ASHRAE 90.1, what are some of the sources that are available from ASHRAE in regards to this?
A couple of things. Of course, one of them, and I'll come back to it, or I'm sure we're going to come back to it, is I want to talk about the user's manual. We do have a user's manual that can be used in conjunction with the standard 90.1, every one of the previous editions, as well as the 2010. A lot of times that contains some very useful information. There are seminars that are held quite often at the ASHRAE winter and summer meetings, where some of the latest things on the standard are being presented on what's in the standard. I know the last few, there's been presentations done by members of my project committee to make folks aware of it. A lot of the local chapters are encouraged, and the state chapters are encouraged to seek out through ASHRAE speakers that will come and make presentations on what some of the changes are. And of course, those are a lot of times are readily available through the ASHRAE headquarters. They'll many times have folks available that can come and put on presentations. And I think ASHRAE, I think sometimes will sponsor seminars and various training sessions that people can attend to. I would say they would probably need to visit the ASHRAE website and find out more information that might be available.
Okay. You mentioned the user's guide. Now, how is that? Can you describe? How would you describe that to somebody? And how is that created? Who's responsible for that?
Yeah, and so for starters, the first thing I'll tell you is, in the strictest sense, the ASHRAE Standard 90.1 committee is actually responsible for the user's manual. Now, that's not to say that we write it. We don't. But when it comes to the development of the standard, we have a responsibility to be involved in, not the standard, of the user's manual. We have a responsibility to be involved in it. What really happens is that ASHRAE, as an organization, will issue a contract to some entity to provide the contractual services and develop the user's manual. And it'll be usually use a combination of folks who are familiar with all the various parts of the standards, maybe architects and engineers that handle building envelope and mechanicals and lighting systems and do energy modeling. And those folks will take the standard itself and break it down into parts, typically done by chapter, and will then write commentary to go along with key parts of the standard to explain how it's to be applied. And many of these folks, not all of them, but many of these folks have experience, either their past experience being on the Standard 90.1 committee or have been attending the meetings, and even a few of the writers can in fact be or are members of the committee. When they write that commentary and put it together in draft within the Standard 90.1 committee itself, my committee, we would assign a oversight group made up of several members of each of our parts of the committee as a whole, who will then be responsible for looking over that commentary. And what we try to make sure is that the commentary reflects written word that explains properly what the standard itself intended. The user's manual is not the standard. The standard stands on its own, but the user's manual is intended to be an explanation. And from that, if there's some material, if during that process when we're looking at as it's being developed, if we feel like some material incorrectly states something, then we will say, no, that is not correct. It needs to be worded somewhat differently and give them suggestions on how it to be worded, although that the contractor working for ASHRAE has responsibility for actually producing the user's manual as a publication. And so it's through that give and take and through that review process that what we try to make sure is that the user's manual helps explain properly what certain provisions of the standard, how they're to be applied, and at the same time the user's manual commentary does not make changes to what the intent of the standard was or is.
So if somebody wanted to get involved with 90.1, how would they go about that?
I think there's a combination of things that they can do. One of the first things, of course, is we generally meet 4 times a year. 2 meetings that we have is each in conjunction with the summer and winter meetings of the ASHRAE organization as a whole. Wherever their summer or winter meetings are held, we are always having meetings there. And then in the interim, we will hold meetings either in Atlanta or Chicago, where we'll actually have our same committee meetings just like we would at the annual winter and summer meetings, but obviously not in the same venue as ASHRAE's full conference meetings are. Anybody who wants to attend the meetings is welcome to come to them. Our meeting times and locations are posted on the ASHRAE website once they're set. These meetings are open to anybody who wants to be there. They're not limited in any way. We also have a listserv. You can go on the ASHRAE website under Standards Action, and from there are listservs that can be signed up. We have a listserv for Standard 90.1. People can sign up for that and receive notices of when we're going to have meetings and various activities that we have going on. If a person wants to be on the committee, of course, they can go to the ASHRAE website and get a project committee application and submit it. Now, just the fact that they submit an application doesn't automatically mean that they'll get placed on the committee, but we do consider any and all interested parties. And one of the things we do, and I'll say I'd have to do as a chair, is to make sure that I do consideration to applicants, but I also need to watch to make sure I maintain balance on my committee. In that way, I don't want to end up with a whole bunch of committee members representing one segment of the construction community. Like all designers, for example, or all equipment manufacturers. We have to have a balance of folks across the board, and so that sometimes has an impact on who can finally be approved for committee membership. But we encourage folks to prior to applying, for them to come to the committee meetings themselves and start participating, attend the subcommittee meetings, show an active interest, because when they do that, then they obviously show that they have an interest and are willing to commit the time. It is a large time commitment and some resources, expenditures to travel to some of the meetings, but we definitely encourage folks to come.
Great. Well, you know what? I appreciate that overview of 90.1. Now, on a different topic, I always like to ask people that I talk to if they have any lessons learned that they like to share with the listeners. So, is there anything that you've learned from your professional life, whether it be in like management, or construction, or what have you, that you'd like to share that said, you know what? I mean, this is something I learned that I'd like to be able to pass on.
Well, I appreciate that opportunity, and in the variety of my time in my career, both as a code official and of course working for the Portland Cement Association in standards development, I think one of the things that I have found is probably foremost is the fact that many times when we're interacting with each other, and it doesn't matter what meeting it is, whether it be a meeting internally in a company or whether it be a meeting between myself and other interested parties, I'll say like when I was a building official, or whether I'm chair of Standard 90.1, that it's usually very important to realize that to be open-minded and listen to what others bring to the table or bring to the meeting. and because a lot of times by listening to others, it doesn't say you have to agree with them, but usually through an open-minded approach and listening to other points of view, I think most folks, when they finish making decisions, will usually make what is the best and right decision after having received that input. And so I find that to be very important. The other thing I will say that I have found to be true is the fact that there's more than one way to skin a cat, and that's the term I'll use. I saw it as a code official, and I see it even involved with standards development and codes development, that we will come up with things that we have in a standard or have in a code and say this is how it ought to be placed in, let's just say, a requirement in a building, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's the only way, that there are other options that usually are available, and so folks always need to be, should be receptive to that alternative approach, because I think in the end, for most folks that I know, if they're interested in, let's say, energy conservation, most folks that are will try to do what's the best and right thing, and so that flexibility, I think, is important, of knowing there's more than one way to do it.
All right. Well, I appreciate your time, Steve, and I know that it's been very informative for me, and hopefully the listeners have enjoyed it as well. So I appreciate your time.
Okay, Matt, thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to be to participate with you.
All right, we're back. Thanks again to Steve for that great interview, spending some time with us out of his busy schedule. We really appreciate that. Also, I want to thank you, the listeners. I really appreciate the support that I've been getting, and I really appreciate each and every one of you as valued listeners. I'm really doing this for you, and hopefully that you're getting some benefit out of it. As always, feel free to send me any comments or show ideas. You can reach me through email at matt@buildingx.co. matt@buildingx.co. Also the blog there at buildingx.co. If you want, you can follow me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is buildingx. And if you're so inclined, always, I'm very receptive to any feedback at iTunes. I would greatly appreciate that. So, until next time, thanks for listening, and remember, know what you build and share what you know.